Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show. Joining us as always on Thursdays, my good friend Duane, Generalissimo Patterson of the Hugh Hewitt Show, master of the universe, HUGHNIVERSE.com, the troll-free web surfing experience for Hugh Hewitt fans and listeners. And Duane, momentous morning to start off with. Breaking news this morning. The game is back on against ISIS in... this time in northwest Syria. Last week it was northeast Syria. Right. And the two might be related. Joe Biden says we took out the leader of ISIS, the successor to al-Baghdadi. His name is al-Quraishi. Appears to have reached room temperature when, or maybe just reached the room. He blew himself up like Baghdadi did, apparently, when special forces showed up.
Well, yeah, it looks like he had a compound that his family was in, and it was in a position where there was really no way out. I mean, if you were worried about a defensive escape plan, this was not the place to be. It apparently was kind of on a mound of a hill, and it was kind of exposed on all four sides. This compound was just on the top of this hill. And apparently our special forces surrounded it, and he saw he was surrounded, had no way out, and decided to take the coward's way out. Not only took himself out, but his wife and kids.
Yeah, he took the wife and kids with him because the initial report said, well, women and children were killed, and then we find out, of course, that it was al-Quraishi who killed them, just like al-Baghdadi did. This is October 2019, so it's 2.5 years ago when we did this.
No U.S. casualties reported as of yet. Look, it's for what it is, it's probably the best news that Joe Biden's been able to point to in months, right? Of any stripe, domestic or foreign policy. It's probably the single best piece of good news he's had in a long time.
The good news is that he got a win here on the counterterrorism front. The bad news is, though, that this is a front that the Biden administration has largely downplayed. I mean, they're wanting to get out of this sort of business here in the Middle East. I mean, so was Donald Trump, but Donald Trump was a little bit more muscular about ISIS in particular. Biden, I'm not sure that Biden, the Biden administration has even really much talked about ISIS. They've kind of wanted to shove that off to the side. Maybe the raid on the prison last week in Hanukkah changed the calculus for them.
Well, ISIS was a thing when Donald Trump came into office because they had the caliphate, right, in Syria, right. And we kind of dispatched that on short order, and shortly after that, ISIS will always still be out there to some variant, just like Al Qaeda is out there to some variant. But that was not something that was really on the top 10 list of anybody's worries going into the last few years of Donald Trump's term. It's not like they were eliminated, but they were fairly well immobilized and not really able to do much of anything. So now Joe Biden comes in and takes over, and in his first year, he, pulls out of Afghanistan, and as Kabul is falling, almost immediately, ISIS is resurging. Different branch, different chapter. But isn't the bomb blast that took out our 13 military in the Kabul airport, Hamid Karzai airport, wasn't that an Al-Qaeda? Or it wasn't an Al-Qaeda attack. I'm sorry, wasn't that?
It was ISIS-K.
ISIS-K attack?
It's an ISIS-K attack, but
Coruscant, yeah.
But I think that those are really just loosely affiliated groups. I don't know that how much the Iraqi Syrian ISIS group has to do with ISIS-K other than just a sort of loose affiliation. I'm not even sure that there's a leadership connection there either. ISIS Khorasan their leadership is in Afghanistan. It's not in Syria.
Correct. Now, what I will say is we have been reading some reports even in places like the New York Times, some in the Washington Post over the last few months, where, hey, don't look now, but it looks like ISIS is starting to kind of coagulate again, and they're starting to grow again, and they're starting to.
Well, right. I mean, that was the raid on the prison in Hanukkah, right? That was just last week that they finally put that down.
So Joe Biden gets credit for knocking down a growing threat, and he should get credit for that.
Yeah, I agree.
But on the other side of that coin is, why would that have been necessary if you kind of took your eye off the ball and let them start to grow again? That's like saying, yay, we defeated cancer. Well, okay, but why did the cancer come back? Well, because we quit treating it and we started to worry about other things, and the cancer kind of came back. But boy, we knocked down that cancer again. Well, okay, congrats, you knocked down the cancer, but
yeah,
why was it necessary, right?
Well, I think that we've had now a couple of administrations that have been too glib about declaring victory over ISIS. ISIS isn't dead. And I think that this demonstrates that ISIS isn't dead, and that we know it's not dead, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or the other. And I grant you, I do think this is a win for Joe Biden. I think it's a good win for Joe Biden. I have no problem giving him credit for this. It happened on his watch. Yeah. He apparently made the call. Something he wasn't going to do with Osama bin Laden in almost exactly the same circumstances, right? But he did this time, and yeah, he absolutely deserves credit for it. Now, whether or not that relates to, this is also a grand opportunity for him to say, okay, well, now ISIS is dead and we're going to leave.
Right. In that scenario you accurately played, though, when he was giving advice about, going in and taking the other hit, he wasn't, in his calculus of thinking then, he wasn't staring at, crashing through the floor of 30% job approval and heading into the 20s. So there, you got to think there's some different political calculus there.
Well, sure.
He's got to show he's tough on something.
Right. I have no problem with any political gain he gets from this, because it's a good outcome for the United States. It's a good outcome for our allies in that region. It's just that it's not over. And if they decide to make this into it's over sort of argument, we'll be back where we were at after we pulled out of Iraq the last time.
If this is the only move he makes, and in 2024 his entire re-election campaign was, hey, look what I did back here, and that's it, that ain't gonna be enough, right?
No, it's not. I do want to point out one thing, though, and I think that this is something that's going to be inside the heads of everybody affiliated with ISIS. The prison thing, I think, started a couple of weeks ago, and our allies, the Syrian Kurds, along with us, we were there as well, ended up defeating the ISIS assault on this prison just 7 days ago. And 7 days after this happens, we find out where al-Quraishi's at, and return him to room temperature, thanks to his own decision to detonate the bomb.
That's record, right?
Well, yeah, but it's just 7 days. I mean, if I'm in the ISIS chain of command at this point in time, don't I have to suspect my entire comms organization has been penetrated? Don't I have to start to try to rebuild that whole entire structure? Because clearly somebody rolled it up all the way to the top and gave it to the Americans. I mean, it may have just been a coincidence. It may have been completely unrelated intelligence that brought us there. But if you were in ISIS at this moment in time, would you just assume that the two weren't related? Because I know I wouldn't assume that.
I wouldn't assume that. Maybe part of the calculus along the way was ISIS looked at Biden as floundering and as inept as the rest of us saw him, and they underestimated him.
Well, especially after Afghanistan. But I mean, this is not Biden. This is American intelligence. This is American military intelligence. I mean, the only thing that Biden would have been involved in directly here was the call to go ahead and conduct the raid, because clearly it's outside of American. Well, it's at least arguably outside of our wartime jurisdiction.
Right.
This is more like Syria proper, right? This isn't the Syrian, this isn't Western Syria. This was in northeastern Syria, and it was close to where Turkey's at. So, I mean, there's all sorts of different things, and that's the reason why Biden might have otherwise been cautious. And for good reason. I'm not suggesting that there wouldn't be good reason for that. But, I mean, the legwork here wasn't done by Joe Biden. Joe Biden wasn't out rolling up the comms lines here.
Right.
If I'm the number 2 or number 3 guy in ISIS right now, I've got to be looking at change it all.
I'm looking for Pakistan about now.
Yeah, or at the very least, you have to deconstruct your entire communications model and rebuild it from scratch at this point in order to make sure. And that, when you're talking about a distributed terrorist network, is really not easy to do.
Correct.
And so
you've got to assume if you're what's left of ISIS now, you've got to assume that pretty much the Americans are probably listening to what you're doing.
Yeah. And look, I mean, again, this is not to argue that ISIS is dead, but it is to argue that this particular kind of strike, 7 days after a defeat, when you're trying to release 3,500 members of your terrorist army from a prison, indicates
that send its own kind of message.
It does send its own kind of message. All right. Speaking of message sending, let's transition to what you and I think is maybe the biggest media story in at least a couple of years. The fall of Jeff Zucker at CNN, and the question of who's next at CNN,
or if there will be anybody next. I mean, who knows? The big question is going to be who's going to take over that network. Time Warner is the parent company, and somebody at Time Warner, at least for now, I don't know if the new Discovery bosses are in charge yet, but
not yet.
As of now, I think Time Warner is still controlling it, and you got to think that somebody's going to come in with like Wilford Brimley with the briefcase at some point, right?
All I know is at the end of the day, I'm going to have somebody's ass in my briefcase.
Yes, I mean that's what I'm saying, right? The thing that's fascinating, and we talked about this last night on my after show, which is there was 2 players in this story. There's Chris Cuomo. There's lots of players.
Andrew
Cuomo,
yeah,
is the glue that holds this whole thing together. But Jeff Zucker falls on his sword after having this affair with his vice president of operations for darn near 10 years, and the paramour, Allison
Gollust,
she's still there. And we were talking about this last night, that come on, she's really, they're not going to be able to keep her there. Now, you and I talked about this. The underling usually gets the benefit of the doubt, and if there's somebody that's going to survive, it's usually the
junior member. Yes,
the junior member of the power couple. But I read in the New York Post this morning a story by Emily Smith. Female employees at CNN are furious that chief spokesperson Allison Gollust, who, by the way, came to CNN after serving as a stint as the comms director for Andrew Cuomo. This whole story is just spectacular. They're furious that she is keeping her job after lying about an affair with newly resigned CEO Jeff Zucker for years, sources told the Post. Why is she allowed to keep her job, a CNN insider railed? CNN is supposed to be a transparent news network. How does she get away with lying about their affair for so long? Ed, if she's there, I don't care if she was the innocent victim. I don't care if she slept her way to the top because she felt that was the only way she could succeed. I don't care if she was doing this under duress. The fact of the matter is, the organization is a corrupt organization.
That's
when
right.
Everybody knew about it. There were pictures this morning that were released. It was all over Twitter of a Billy Joel concert last year in which Zucker went to the concert with his girlfriend, not his wife, with Allison, the vice president. And you know who was sitting in seats like, 2 rows up? You want to take a guess?
Oh, I'm just going to say Gullist.
No, she was his date.
Oh, that's right. She was his
concert.
date. Was it, I don't know, Chris Cuomo? I don't know. Brian Stelter?
Stelter was there and Don Lemon was there. Everybody knew. This was not a secret. Everybody in that building knew that the two of them were stumping each other.
Yep. And
that they were the power couple, right? You don't mess with one because you're going to mess with the other one. And it was, everybody was walking on eggshells about this. So Zucker, because Chris Cuomo comes at him hard because Chris Cuomo is, well, one, he's Italian, and two, he's pretty vindictive. He starts coming after. Hey. I know. So Chris Cuomo comes after Jeff Zucker and says, "Okay, Zucker, you fire me, I'm going to burn this whole place down." And he says, "I got the goods on you," which, of course, because of his brother, he probably did. And so Zucker said, "Okay, I guess I can't do this anymore. I'm out." But so Allison's going to just get the job by default in a stopgap measure until Discovery takes over.
Well,
and
no,
Discovery's got this.
They've got a triumvirate now that's taken over. Allison Gullist is not a member of the triumvirate, right? I mean, this came out later yesterday. Initially, they were saying, well, Gullist might end up taking over, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you started seeing all these. Jeff Zucker is the sweetest, nicest, most kindest, caringest, Manchurian candidate. CNN
right,
president.
Because you had the equivalent of, okay, so Kim Jong-un's not around, but the sister still is, right? I mean, so everyone's like, okay, I guess we can't bag on the little fat kid because his sister, who's even more brutal, is still around.
Right, the hatchet woman is still there. So yeah, that was
right.
She's still there, so they still have to be careful about this. But Jason Kilar, I think is his name, or Kilar, from Warner Media, is one of the three that's taken over. And I don't know
unless
if you've seen
unless he's coming in with a shroud and a scythe, it's not going to work.
No, it's not going to work.
Lemon's got to go. Stelter's got to go. Daniel Dale's got to go. There's lots
Darcy
of people
should go too.
Oliver Darcy's got to go. There's lots. I mean, look, you and I both could reprogram CNN in about a day and get them to the point where they would crush MSNBC within a month, right?
Right.
We'd put Mary Catherine Ham on in prime time, right?
And maybe Joe Rogan.
Give her a show. Offer Joe Rogan a job. I mean, there are some contributors there who you could give a gig to and actually
I'd put Van Jones on his own show.
I would put Van Jones on his own show.
Would be sharp as hell on his own show. And I don't even agree with anything that Van Jones has to say, but he's good.
He's transparent and he's honest.
And he's smart.
He's at least honest, and when he knows that his side has screwed the pooch, he'll fess up to it.
Yep.
And if you're at least honest about it, that's at least kind of winsome, and that's somewhat compelling because you can build a little trust with a guy. You can correct for the lie of the green and say I don't agree with his positions, but if something goes on that you as a conservative think that, okay, Democrats, there's no way they can defend this, and everybody on the left, media, electeds, whoever, everybody's defending whatever this obscenity of the day is, And then you turn on Van Jones and he says, man, this sucked. I wouldn't have done it this way, right?
Right.
If he had that kind of a take on there, people would watch that. Again, Mary Catherine Ham. If you gave Mary Catherine Ham a primetime slot, people are going to watch that show.
People would watch the hell out of that show. And furthermore, Mary Catherine Ham would have people on there who disagreed with her. I mean, she's used to it. She's disagreeing with everybody else on CNN when they bring her on for these, talking head hits. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
You could build a primetime around Mary Catherine Ham and Van Jones, and I think it would make one hell of a 1-2 punch. Bring in Joe Rogan for the late night. Joe Rogan's not a CNN contributor, but I mean, but to your point, you could look in and around CNN. You could turn CNN around in like a nanosecond, right? Yep. Absolutely. But they have to want to change. And so the Warner Media guy, this Kylar, I don't know how the name's pronounced. Apparently the story is, and New York Magazine is very skeptical of this story, but supposedly Kylar didn't know about what was going on between Zucker and Gollust until this investigation took place. I mean, the guy's been CEO for almost 2 years in charge of CNN, and he didn't know that his number one guy at their number one asset was sleeping with his number 2 or number 3 executive vice president for years. Okay,
let's talk about this for a second. How many people within the on-air or editorial broadcast role of CNN, how many people do you think in that newsroom didn't know? 0. I'm not talking about Time Warner. I'm talking about on-air talent or producers or editors. How many people within the CNN universe for the last 10 years didn't know this was going on?
If you believe Roland Martin and Soledad O'Brien, and I have no reason to disbelieve them, everybody in that room knew in 2013. In 2013, everybody in that room knew. 2013, 8 years ago, 9 years ago.
Again, we saw photos from a Billy Joel concert from late last year where Jeff Zucker was attending a concert on a date with his girlfriend. Remember, he's still married at the time.
Not late last year. He would have been divorced and she would have been divorced by that time.
Okay, I'm sorry. You're right. But dating his girlfriend that
the executive vice president.
The executive vice president that used to live with her husband in the apartment above his when he was married. Right?
Right.
Okay. So if everybody in the building knew, everyone knew, right?
Knew. Yep.
Okay. So if this is the case and the Time Warner CEO is so disconnected that Shazam, I had no idea this was going on. Why didn't anybody tell me this? Golly. Right? So you got Gomer Pyle, who's the CEO of Time Warner, who is just dumbstruck that this is going on. That says one of two things. It says one of two things. Either Time Warner is just stupid about the entities they own, and it's possible.
Sure.
I doubt it, but it's possible. Or all of this talk about, but Jeff Zucker's such a nice guy. He's such a genius. He's always been kind to me. That's hostage video material.
Yep.
It means that everybody in the building was terrified of being the one leaking that because of what could come after them.
Yep. And I think you're still seeing hostage videos now. And that's the point, the whole Allison Camerota thing. It
means Jeff Zucker may have this outward appearance of being a nice enough guy. But if you work there, my guess is he wasn't the nicest guy in the world to work for.
Well, I don't know a boss who's really the nicest at that level. Who's really the nicest guy in the world to work for? You got to be tough as nails to get up to that position in the first place, and so I mean, I'm not going to begrudge a guy for being a tough boss. I've worked for tough bosses that I've liked anyway.
understand, but don't give me this Allison Camerata stuff.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. Oh, what a sweetheart of a guy. We're all going to miss him.
Bull stuff.
Yeah. So if Keelar is who was it that you just said that Keelar would have been? Gomer Pyle.
Gomer Pyle.
What does that make Brian Stelter? Jar Jar Binks? I mean, I'm not sure. This is a guy who in August 2021 was on the Colbert Show saying, I don't understand what ethical issues might be in play here. We're kind of off the map. And you've got Eric Wemple late last night saying, oh yeah, by the way, it was Zucker and Gullis that arranged the whole Cuomo Brothers show. And don't tell me that Brian Stelter at CNN couldn't have figured that much out, knowing that he's sleeping with Gullis who worked for Cuomo. I mean,
Brian Stelter is the Sergeant Schultz of CNN.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Sergeant Schultz, I get. There you go. Okay.
I know nothing. I see. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. That's better than Jar Jar Binks. At any rate, though, I mean, Stelter's got, I mean, they really need to clean house. I think we've already talked about this. They need to clean house in order to restore credibility. We're coming up to the end here.
Well, just real quick, real quick on this, since we're on Stelter. Late last night, he tweets, late night at the office, still making calls to sources. Reliable newsletter will be up by midnight East Coast time. And I couldn't help myself. I retweeted it and I said, bless his little heart. He's convinced himself that there are people out there who believe that he's an honest broker working hard to report on the corruption that's been endemic at CNN for a decade right under his blinking nose.
Yeah. Reliable sources indeed. All right, just a couple minutes left. I guess we got to talk about what's coming up on Hugh Hewitt Show on Friday morning, what's coming up in the after show on Thursday evening. I want to leave a couple of minutes for that, but just quickly, econ report coming out, jobs report coming out. You and I discussed the ADP report. What's your prediction on the BLS report, and what do you think it's going to mean for Joe Biden when it hits?
Okay, so I predict the BLM. Just to remind people, the ADP number came out negative 301,000.
Yeah,
which was
astounding.
A train wreck of a number, right?
Right.
My guess is the number comes out at minus 180, just shy of 200. That's my guess. And Jen Psaki will spin it as a positive because it's not as bad as what ADP was. We actually gained 100,000 jobs from what ADP said it would be.
Yeah,
and that's how she'll try to spin it.
I think it'll be slightly negative on Friday morning. I think it'll be somewhere around like minus 40, minus 50. I don't think it'll be minus 100. I think ADP misses to the downside as much as they miss to the upside here. But I think it'll be slightly negative.
Now let's do WAS, right? Wild ass speculation. We're
a big fan of WAS here at the Ed Morrissey Show.
Of course we are. We're pundits. That's what we do. It's just wild ass speculation. Let's assume that the number comes out and it's like 500,000 in negative. Let's say it's like, oh no, right? Then what happens? How do you spin that?
There's no spinning.
This just shows we need Build Back Better.
No, inflation shows that we don't want to be anywhere near Build Back Better. I think that if you have a loss like that, I think it really resets the dials on moving Biden to the center. Because at that point, politically speaking, that's death. And he's going to have to start looking for some really quick, easy wins that he can start holding up as as an example of his progress.
Disagree with you 1,000%. I think what he's going to do is he's going to come out and he's going to say, if it weren't for these recalcitrant Republicans, if it weren't for the Republicans saying no to everything, we would be making more progress. This is all the Republicans' fault. That's what they're going to go with.
Except for the fact that, of course, Joe Manchin was the Republicans weren't the reason why they couldn't get it passed through reconciliation. So, yeah.
And it wasn't even just Joe Manchin.
That was Kirsten Sinema, too. And it might have been a couple other Democratic senators, to be honest, but they were awfully quiet during this thing, and for good reason.
Were.
All right. So that's our wild-ass speculation of the week, folks. Now, we don't need to speculate on this. What's coming up on tonight's after show in the universe?
Just me and the news. Thursdays are normally when I just kind of load up as much content as I can, and I just will hit go, and sometimes I'll go an hour and a half, hour 45 minutes, and just go until I exhaust myself and have covered the news the way the news should be covered. It's riotous and raucous fun, and you never know what kind of tirades I may go on.
All right. So what's coming up on tomorrow morning's Hugh Hewitt show, starting at 6 a.m. Eastern Time?
Well, we will be doing our movie segment with Sonny Bunch, which I don't know what that's going to look like, because speaking of death zone, when you're talking about Biden and jobs reports, there's not a lot out to see right now in the theaters, is there? It's kind of, we're down to Netflix at this point,
or Daily Wire. They've got a new show dropping at the Daily Wire thing. It's Shut In. You should ask them about that.
That's true. So we'll talk to Sonny Bunch a little bit, but we will also talk to our mutual good friend Jim Garrity. Jim is he's about as good consistently on the virus reporting as anybody I've seen in town. Covering what's going on in Virginia, covering the the vaccine mandates and the politics around it. Jim has just been aces on this, right? And we're gonna have Garrity the indispensable on tomorrow. He's one of our favorites.
I got to get Garrity back in here. We kind of fell off the radar screen from each other because it just the timing on my show just never worked for him. Now that we're back to a podcast format, I got to get him back in here.
And you know what? We had done that too a lot because of the age of his kids. But now his kids are a little bit older.
Yep.
And he's got little pockets and windows of time now. And I'll tell you what'll happen. The first time you get him back on again and you talk to him, you're going to get off of that podcast and you're going to say, I forgot how really good he is.
Oh, he's great. He's great at this.
He's just tremendous.
Yeah, he's terrific at this. So yeah, absolutely. All right. Yeah. So that's coming up tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday, February 4th, and 5 a.m. in God's time zone, which is God's frozen time zone, by the way, today, because snowfall and ice here in Texas. 3 a.m. on the left coast. You can watch it live in the universe, HUGHNIVERSE.com. The troll-free web surfing experience for Hugh Hewitt fans and listeners. If you're not a member, you're missing out on so much, all that great after-show stuff that Duane does, all the other great original content in the universe. But you can still listen to it live on your AM radio dial. Duane, what should people do if they can't find it on their AM radio dial?
Well, I think the answer speaks for itself. I think you bring in Chris Cuomo with you, right? you go into a station where we should belong. There's at least a 50% chance that general manager's got a connection to Andrew Cuomo, and Chris will exploit it. I mean, the guy is a walking horse's head, right?
Right. I was going to suggest Allison Gullis for the exact same reason, right? Maybe bring in Jason Kyler or Keeler. Again, not sure how he pronounces his name, from Warner Media. I don't know. Bring in the triumvirate.
See, I don't think you bring in Allison yet, because apparently, for at least right now, she still has a job. Why, I don't know, but apparently she still does.
Will she be offered a job in the Hugh Hewitt universe? That's what I want to know.
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. Duane Generalissimo Patterson. There's only one Generalissimo in the Hugh Hewitt universe, and it's Duane Generalissimo Patterson. Thank you so much for being with us, as always, on Thursdays. Have a great rest of your day, sir.
My pleasure. See you guys next week.
Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show. Joining us right now is Daniel Dew from Pacific Legal Foundation, a great organization, does a lot of great work in defending defending all sorts of rights, defending religious liberty rights, defending property rights. They do a lot of really good work. They've got a Supreme Court case coming up in an unrelated issue with Sackett v. EPA. But joining us to talk right now about this is Daniel Dew regarding the vaccine mask mandates in Kentucky and elsewhere. And he's legal policy director at Pacific Legal Foundation, pacificlegal.org, by the way, is where you can find out all about the cases that they pursue. And Daniel, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So, I mean, and Pacific Legal does like I said, does a lot of great work in all sorts of different areas. You have a new video out that we're hopefully going to add in to the same podcast here regarding Kentucky's emergency powers, the restaurants and the restaurants that are impacted by these. You focus on one, Trendy's, which is a Georgetown, Kentucky restaurant and bar. But give us what's going on in Kentucky. What's the problem in Kentucky?
Sure. So Kentucky actually wasn't unique. Like a lot of the country in March of 2020, because of COVID, governors unilaterally used their emergency powers to compel people to stay home. They identified certain businesses as necessary businesses, and others are not so necessary, and so closing the economy. And really what we saw is that initially, maybe it was warranted because we didn't really know what COVID was, how dangerous it was, but then it became months and months, and then a year, 2 years. I mean, we're still seeing a lot of places under emergency orders right now, where governors have really shut out the legislature and unilaterally are making these decisions. And so Kentucky was a place where we were able to work with the legislature, and they were able to give the legislature meaningful oversight over the governor's emergency powers, and it actually ended up in a lawsuit.
Well, as most of these things have ended up in lawsuits, right? I mean, these emergency powers are generally speaking assigned to executives for just a short period of time. But we've seen this in Kentucky. We've seen this in Minnesota, where I used to live. We've seen this in Michigan, where governors who get these emergency powers resist any sort of limitation to them and just continuously continuously refresh the emergency in order to get around any sort of limitations on these powers. And that's a problem in and of itself. I mean, that's one thing, but it's not just the fact that Governor Beshear has those emergency powers, but it's the restrictions that he's put in place through those emergency powers. So tell us a little bit about how that impacts Trendy's and other such restaurants in Kentucky.
Sure. So they really placed arbitrary restrictions. So for example, if you were a restaurant, you could stay open, but you had to serve food along with alcohol. You couldn't just do alcohol. And popcorn or pretzels wasn't enough. That wasn't enough food to stay open. They placed curfews that were arbitrary, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight. And so really they were just making up these arbitrary rules that were constantly changing, and businesses were trying to adapt, but they just couldn't. So eventually they had to let people go, and they had to they lost a lot of money, a lot of revenue that was coming into the community was just being lost because of these arbitrary rules. And at the same time, big box stores and places like Amazon and things like that were able to excel because they didn't have the same kind of restrictions.
Yeah, Daniel, I mean, I think that this is part of the issue that came up in regards to the restrictions on places of worship. And it took the Supreme Court 3 tries to get that one right. But where you had severe restrictions on how places of worship could operate in the same neighborhoods that big box stores were allowed to continue operating, because they saw the tax revenue from those places as being, a serious issue, while churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques were not. And eventually the Supreme Court came around on that and said, no, look, you got similarly situated businesses. You can't have two different rules, especially in light of the First Amendment and the right to access worship spaces. That same sort of arbitrariness, I think, once it starts moving its way up the chain in court, is going to be a big problem for Beshear and Kentucky, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, not to keep picking on Governor Beshear, but I mean, on Easter Sunday in 2020, he sent state troopers to churches where they were worshiping, and they were taking down license plates and telling people that they had to quarantine. I mean, going to churches on Easter Sunday and doing something like that is just unconscionable.
Yeah.
So after the reforms were passed, Governor Beshear did something that I've never seen before. He sued the legislature to stop the law that restricted his emergency powers from going into effect, which is just strange. He found a friendly judge that agreed with him, put a temporary order staying the law going into effect. We sued on behalf of our clients in another jurisdiction. We met at the Kentucky Supreme Court, and unanimously the Kentucky Supreme Court said that there are not inherent emergency powers, that the governor can only have what the legislature gives him.
Right.
And so luckily the between the legislature and the judicial branch, they served as meaningful checks on the executive, and that's the way government is supposed to work. But for far too long, in almost every state, we just haven't had those checks and balances.
Well, and what's interesting about this is now we're in 2022. I mean, we're almost to the 2-year mark in terms of the American pandemic response, which really started in March 2022. There's some federal stuff regarding international travel, but in terms of, lockdowns and, business restrictions, those really started in March 2020. And so it's hard to argue that there's still an emergency. I mean, at this point in time, there's been plenty of opportunity for the legislature to provide legislative support for whatever restrictions are going to be put in place, which would allow for some sort of stability and predictability. Instead, Beshear is apparently still hanging on to this emergency authority and is still trying to impose these restrictions on a populace that is largely vaccinated, probably mostly exposed to one variant or another in COVID-19. I mean, does he have an explanation for why he's continuing to use these emergency powers and trying to defend them in court?
Well, luckily the court has spoken on the issue, and the legislature and our clients ended up being victorious. So he's still trying to use what power he has. And in other states, we're seeing other governors still wielding these emergency powers. And I mean, one of the more disheartening things that we've seen is that we've seen legislatures refuse to step in and make these reforms because they like their governor, or they like what the governor has done. But that's not the point. And this is so Pacific Legal Foundation, we've talked about the separation of powers for a long time. Justice Scalia, one of the things that he used to always talk about is that, look at any banana republic, look at any dictator, their countries, they have fantastic bills of rights. Look at North Korea's, look at Russia's, they look fantastic. But they're meaningless because there's no checks and balances. There's no separation of powers. That's what separates the United States from these other countries. That's why we have meaningful individual liberty. And so, when legislatures refuse to step in and retake their power and play the part of the meaningful check, then that's why we see lockdowns that go on forever and things that aren't really balanced, aren't really debated. It's who has access to the governor, and those are the people who get the favorable rules, and everybody else, just has to go by the whim of what the governor wants.
Well, and I would argue that there's another reason why legislatures haven't acted. It's because there's political risk in taking that kind of action. And I think that the descent into what I would call sort of poisonous partisanship has created a situation where, and this is true under Republicans, it's true under Democrats, where the party basically runs things rather than the institutions. And what I mean by this, and Daniel, I'd love to get your perspective on this because you guys are fighting on this front line all the time, is that legislatures see an opportunity to allow an executive of their own party to basically take all the risks and look like a strong leader and all this kind of stuff to sort of boost party fortunes as long as he performs well, while they don't have to take risky votes at all, and they can mutter about whatever it is that they want to mutter about in legislative hearings to get sound bites, but they don't do any substantive legislating. And it's not just in terms of emergencies. This is more or less the status quo now, not just at the federal level, but in several of the states. And I think that we're seeing that highlighted in the pandemic, but I don't think it's limited to the pandemic. I'm not even sure it's limited to emergency measures.
Yeah, no, you are 100% right. So just a couple of examples, but in context of the emergency issue, I actually think that the legislature's not stepping in made COVID and COVID responses more political.
Yep.
So if legislatures had to step in April 2020 and to affirm what their governors were doing, I think most of them would have done it because we didn't know. There wasn't a lot known. I think governors also would have been more careful in the orders that they put out there. But because they weren't involved for so long in that process, they were able to sit back, play Monday morning quarterback, and criticize everything that governors did. And that just made the whole response more political. But and I think that you're right that it extends to other areas. I mean, so one of the things that was done was at the federal level was the CDC Eviction Moratorium, right? Where people couldn't be evicted. And I think that one of the most bizarre things, if you know our form of government, is that you had Nancy Pelosi, who is the most powerful legislator in the country. She makes, she runs, Congress, the House of Representatives, and she is petitioning the CDC and unelected bureaucracy within the executive branch to extend these eviction moratoriums. It's just completely backwards of the way that government is supposed to work. The legislature is supposed to be the lawmaking, policy-setting body for our government.
It is supposed to be. It is supposed to be an independent authority too. And back in the day when parties were a little bit more regional than they were ideological, you had some, and I would argue, and this is really getting into the weeds, but I would argue before this is really back in the day, before the passage of the 17th Amendment, you had natural tensions that allowed the legislature to perform that duty, and in fact incentivized legislatures to perform that duty, at least Congress, in relation to the 17th Amendment, because senators picked by the states would be representing the interests of the states rather than senators elected by parties representing the interests of the party. And it's that loss of the institutional distance, I think, between legislating and executive powers that is part of the problem. And we see it expressed at the federal level in terms of executive orders. Now, not all executive orders are bad, right? I mean, the executive orders that fully fit within the executive branch's authority are just simply policy decisions. That's not a big deal. But what you see now is because Congress won't take votes on issues, they've either sloughed it off to agencies with these extremely broad enabling acts for these agencies, or they just put pressure on the president to act unilaterally. And the student loan issue is one really good example of that right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, think about what President Obama said. Not that he was the first or
the last,
but said that we're going to get stuff done. I'm going to do it with my phone, and I've got a phone and I've got a pen. President Trump was guilty of this as well.
Yep.
President Biden is certainly guilty of it. And it's just, we have all of this impatience that we don't want to go through the hard process of making law. It's supposed to be hard to make law. It's supposed to be hard to pass these laws that can take away individuals' liberty or property. And these shortcuts are really problematic. And this is why we think that the emergency issue is going to go beyond just COVID-19. There's the editorial pages have been littered with people calling on governors to issue emergency proclamations for climate change and homelessness and racial disparity and all these things that there may be a proper government role to respond, but it should go through a legislative process. You can't just have one person say, you know what, this is really important. I'm going to declare an emergency. And so for as long as I think it's necessary, I'm going to be able to make rules unilaterally and impose my will. But that's how people are what people are pushing in some certain circumstances.
Right. And that's the risk, right? I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic was a true emergency in the first several weeks when it broke out. It was a true emergency. It was a novel virus. There was no immunity within humanity to this thing. We didn't know what the impacts were, but we knew it was deadly. But the emergency should have lasted only long enough to get legislatures involved in crafting solutions that were broadly supported, or at least broadly supportable, rather than executive orders directed at whim for months on end. Years now. We're coming up to 2 years of this, and we're still seeing some governors, not Bashir, exercise some emergency authority. Now, the good news, and I want to make sure we get to the good news here, is that Pacific Legal Foundation is doing more than just complaining about this. They actually have an effort here called Restoring Constitutional Government in Times of Emergency, and this is a piece of model legislation that will limit emergency powers in the states. Tell us a little bit, Daniel, about this model legislation.
Yeah, so we acknowledge that there are times when governors have to act quickly to save life or property. And so we suggest 30 days that a governor can declare an emergency, and emergency orders can last 30 days. But after that 30 days, they should be resolved. They should be supported by the legislature if they're going to extend beyond that. So we want to make sure that there's meaningful legislative oversight. You talked about governors who would keep issuing the same emergency orders over and over and over again, because a lot of states already had a time limit. So our model bill has an anti-circumvention provision that basically says that a governor can't reissue an order that is substantially similar or the same as an order that either expired or was rejected by the legislature. We want to make sure that courts are stepping in and doing their job. So emergency orders have to be narrowly tailored to serve a compelling public health or safety interest. And then there's expedited judicial review, making sure courts aren't punting. Because I think that what we saw all too often is that courts were stepping back and saying, this is an emergency, we don't want to get involved. But constitutional rights matter even in times of emergency. So making sure that those constitutional rights are protected. Providing means for legislatures to meet virtually if their constitution allows for that. Just providing every means necessary so that legislatures and judiciary has a chance to perform its proper function of government, because that's what we want. We want the governor to have powers to steady the ship, not set a new course, and make sure that the other branches step in as soon as possible to fulfill their constitutional roles and protect individual liberty.
Well, right. And I think that these are reasonable. I mean, this is a reasonable framework, right? Because unless you're dealing with an emergency in which the legislature simply is gone, right? 30 days is plenty of time to get a legislature together to make some decisions based on solid facts on the ground and input from voters as to how to handle something that's going to last longer than 30 days. I mean, you have a status quo that lasts longer than a year. It's not an emergency. It's just it may be a catastrophe, but it's not an emergency anymore. Emergency means emergent, means it's just come up. Everything else is a public policy issue, and public policies should be legislated.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what the legislature is there for. The framers and founders were very, very articulate in saying that the legislature is the most dangerous branch of government because it has the power of the purse and it has the power to make laws.
And it should be. We want it to be the most dangerous because it's having, just using Congress as an example, each state has a different level of a different number of legislators, but having 535 people having that dangerous power makes a whole lot more sense than having one person having that dangerous power. And that's the reason why when they were crafting the Constitution, which is not necessarily a requirement in terms of state government structure, but has been followed in every state government anyway. They crafted it with that in mind, is that a bicameral legislation with one house representing states and one house representing the people should be the ones that craft the legislation under which free people choose to govern themselves. One person is a bad system for that.
Absolutely. I mean, I would challenge anybody to try to get in contact with a state legislator that represents you. You could probably get that person on the phone within a week. Good luck doing that with your governor.
Well, true, right, and and exactly. It's about accountability. It's about checks and balances. So if you go to pacificlegal.org and look up pacificlegal.org/emergency-powers/, or you can just go there and look for limit emergency powers on the left-hand side. There's a great model legislation package there, proposal, that I think really should be brought up in every state legislature and probably in Congress as well. Daniel, dude, what else do you want to let us know about Pacific Legal Foundation before we wrap up?
Yeah, we're working on a whole host of issues. We, as you mentioned at the beginning, we work on property rights, individual liberty, separation of powers, economic liberty and equality. We're excited to work. We primarily work through the courts, but my team works with legislatures. So we're happy to help any way people see fit.
All right, Daniel. Well, thanks so much for all the good work you're doing, and be sure to drop by every once in a while and update us on what it is that you're doing in terms of legislative efforts. And of course, we'll hear more from Pacific Legal Foundation as we go along, because they're doing lots and lots of great work. Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com for Town Hall. It has been more than 5 months since Joe Biden disgracefully abandoned thousands of Americans and tens of thousands of our allies in Afghanistan. For most of that time, our national media has steadfastly averted its eyes from this moral stain on the presidency. While individual journalists have pressed the State Department for answers and updates, their employers have rarely, if ever, reported on the topic. Now the liberal media outlet The Atlantic finally delivered a devastating report on Biden's catastrophic retreat from Afghanistan. George Packer oddly avoids the topic of abandoned Americans, but he makes clear the lack of empathy or purpose in Biden's actions other than indulging his vanity at the expense of American credibility. His chaotic withdrawal, Packer concludes, added moral injury to military failure. Biden isn't the only perpetrator of this moral injury. The American media disgraced itself by ignoring Biden's dishonorable abandonment of Americans and allies alike. Will other media outlets follow the example from Packer and The Atlantic and cover this story, or will they continue to carry Biden's water instead? I'm Ed Morrissey. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show. Joining me now is Jonathan Emord. He is a constitutional law attorney. He's an author, frequent Townhall.com contributor, and the author of a couple of books we've got to discuss. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
So, before we even get to your column about non-citizen voting, which I think is a an overlooked but very important discussion. I know that you've written a couple of books that our audience is going to be very, very interested in. One is heavier than the other. Maybe you can go ahead and tell us a little bit about both of the books that you've got going on right now.
All right, I'll take the lighter first. Lighter both in substance and in weight. There it is. It's the lovely How Biden Stole Christmas, Hanukkah, and Kwanzaa Too. Now, this is as you might suspect, a book of verse. And there are a number of characters, not least of which is the main character, Joe Biden. And so it goes through and it lists all of the foibles of Biden over the first year of his presidency. And here's Ron Klain. He's also in there. That's the chief of staff to the president. He's dancing the Irish jig there.
Very nice.
And that's because you might also find familiar some of these things like AOC's Tax the Rich, which a lot of people don't realize are on Biden's PJs, but there we go.
There you go.
So it's a bit of lighthearted humor, but actually it's rather pointed and probably not well received at the White House. But you know who is well received at the White House? There he is, Xi Jinping. So there he is. And look at the money around the feet of Biden. Yes, of course.
Yes, there you go.
Oh, yes, there we go. So anyway, it's lighthearted humor for the holidays. Now, the heavier one of the two, this is heavy stuff. This one is the Authoritarians. There we go.
There you go. The Authoritarians, yes.
Yeah, and what this does is documents the history of socialism in America from actually the antebellum South, where Friedrich Hegel's doctrine, which of collectivism, was accepted by the Confederates as the basis for the Confederacy and the primary justification for the institution of slavery, because a lot of people don't realize that Hegel, who was the teacher of Karl Marx and is the predecessor of communism in that sense, he believed in socialism, collectivism, was actually accepted as the doctrinal substitute for the Declaration of Independence and the notion of limited government that Jefferson introduced into the Declaration in the second paragraph. So they couldn't deal with this conflict between slavery, which they wished to keep, and the principles of the Declaration's second paragraph. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they jettisoned Jefferson. They actually even condemned him. And he was a Southerner, as we know.
Right.
So anyway, the book documents that. It documents the rise of socialism inside the bureaucracy, predating the street violence of BLM and Antifa, and then takes us all the way up to the present and shows how the two are actually working in complicity with one another to foment a socialist revolution, which is where we are now with the overt attempts by the White House and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to bring us a socialist state. So there you are. It's obviously heavier subject matter, and that justifies the weightier version of the book, you see. And if you don't like the book, don't worry about it, because just lifting it will add to your muscle tissue and improve your health.
Yeah, there's definitely a cardio aspect to this. So I would say make sure you get the Authoritarians and, of course, the Cardio for Laughter. The first book, and again, it's a complicated title. It's a Dr. Seuss satire. Give us the name of that one more time.
Well, here it is again. It is How Biden Stole Christmas, Hanukkah, and Kwanzaa too. So
well, there you go.
It's a little bit of a graduation beyond Dr. Seuss, I think. It's all politics. It's not a children's book, but actually you can read it to your children. It rhymes and it'll help prepare them for their generation dealing with socialism.
I think that's a good preparation indeed. Now, Jonathan, we want to get to your column. It was it was published on December 10th over at townhall.com. And it's regarding a new law in New York City, which is going to allow non-citizens the right to vote. Now, New York City is not the first city to adopt this, right? I think, if I remember correctly, Seattle adopted this as well. There's some other, I think, smaller enclaves that have adopted this at least as a statement of principle, if not necessarily a legal mechanism. And And
San Fran as well. San Francisco.
San Francisco. Well, I guess I'm not surprised. Color me unsurprised that San Francisco has adopted this. There's a school of thought that says, well, the non-citizens are being governed the same as the citizens, so that they should have a say in how that is being done. It is for federal office, they are ineligible to vote. Can states and cities allow this? And even if they can, you argue that this is a very, very bad idea.
Yeah, no, they can't. It is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which expressly applies not only to the federal government, but to the states. So the federal Constitution provides, and I'll read the language here, all persons, this is the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. This defines what it means to be a citizen, which is inherent to citizenship is the right to vote. So all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So in order to be a citizen, which is intimately tied in each of the state constitutions to the right to vote, you have to be a citizen to vote. For example, under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 of the Constitution, we have the definition of naturalization. So first of all, we ask ourselves, can you be a citizen of the United States? Under the Constitution, you can be a citizen of the United States under two circumstances. You're born here or you are naturalized. The definition of naturalization is not delegated to the states. It is reserved to the federal government by the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, where naturalization is defined as that power which the United States can exercise to render a non-citizen a person who can be equal to a natural born citizen. So the only power to do that, to equate the rights of citizenship of a person born here with someone who was not born here, is a congressional power. So the locality can't assume that power. It can't say suddenly all these people can vote, they can have all the rights of citizenship for the offices, the local offices. Not only that, under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, actually Article 4, Section 1, I think, I'm not sure, but it's in Article 4. So it says that an individual officer in both the federal government and the states must swear an oath to uphold, not to uphold, to support, that's the language, support the Constitution of the United States. In order to in other words, for these town council people who had to swear that oath under the federal Constitution is required,
right?
They could not act contrary to the Constitution. I mean, it's not an option, but to make that perfectly clear, they have sworn an oath as a condition precedent to their sitting as town council members to support the Constitution. So they're undermining the Constitution directly. But then in the state constitutions, for example, Article 2, Section 1 of the New York Constitution, only citizens are entitled to vote at every election for all officers elected by the people. So connecting all the dots, each state says only citizens can vote. New York says that same thing. A citizen is defined not by the state, but by the federal Constitution in the 14th Amendment. And anyone who's not born here can be naturalized only by act of Congress. Now, to make matters worse, Congress has enacted naturalization laws which compel people to swear allegiance to the United States, to be willing to defend the Constitution and take up arms in defense of the Constitution, to renounce their former citizenship, and to actually comprehend the requirements of the Constitution as a condition precedent to them becoming citizens of the United States, in addition to the other eligibility criteria, which go to issues related to their employability and so forth, and their lack of association with any organization that means to do harm or any criminal organization. So all of that vetting, of course, is not taking place. And as a result, non-citizens who could be criminals, who may be terrorists, who may be involved in international drug trafficking or in gangs, are being given the right to determine who will be mayor, city council member, public defender, etc., in New York City, and as you point out, elsewhere.
Jonathan, so this raises a couple of questions. The first being, why hasn't this been effectively challenged in court up until now? Because I don't think it's new in Seattle. I want to say that this was maybe a few years ago that Seattle adopted this, and I think the same thing is true with San Francisco. I don't think that was extremely recent. I mean, they've operated under this condition now for at least one municipal election cycle, I would say, in Seattle.
Yeah, it's rather striking, and it's a testimony, a sad testimony, to the willingness of the population to allow it. Right.
Right.
So that there hasn't been a challenge. Now in New York City, a challenge is underway because the Republican Party there and several elected officials who are Republicans have said that they will not tolerate this. This is patently unconstitutional. Now, you didn't see that same thing in Seattle, in the city, because they're all Democrats. And then you didn't see that in San Francisco because why? Well, they're all Democrats who are in the government. And the overwhelming majority of voters in the city of Seattle and in the city of San Francisco are Democrats, and not just Democrats with a small d, but I mean Democrats with a big socialist D. And as a result, they're quite delighted by that change. But it is ripe for challenge. So if any resident of Seattle or of San Francisco wants to go to bat and challenge that, they could. If they're a voter, they would be eligible to do it.
Right. I mean, it's one thing to say that there's no Republicans in city government in San Francisco, Seattle, and New York. I mean, I think that's a fairly good statement, and I think it's fairly obvious. I'm not even sure that Republicans bother to run for some of these seats any longer. I no longer live near Minneapolis, but I did for 24 years. And I'm not necessarily sure that any Republican actually ran for a city council office, for instance, in Minneapolis. I'm not sure. Minneapolis was playing around with the idea of having non-citizen voting. I don't know if they ever executed that or not. But any voter really should have standing in court, right? I mean, this is something that impacts the voters in this enough to be able to get standing to challenge this as unconstitutional. I would assume that would be almost a slam dunk on the standing issue anyway.
Yes, because it dilutes the person's right to vote. Now, they would have to be a voter. In other words, they couldn't just be a person who has no intention of voting.
Right.
They would have to be a person who intends to vote, and preferably one who has voted. But without question, allowing non-citizens to exercise the franchise, particularly with the numbers of non-citizens in these cities, it very severely dilutes the right of citizenship, dilutes the right of citizens to have democracy work for them, and minimizes the impact of their vote. And that's the real problem with it. So, of course, they would have a right to sue.
Jonathan, has there been any such challenges in court before? Do we have precedent on this, or is this just such a recent innovation that it hasn't even come up yet in any sort of state or federal court?
To my knowledge, there's not been a challenge. There have been localities where these events have taken place, where other than the cities we're talking about. But to my knowledge, there's not been a fulsome challenge to the law under the 14th Amendment and under the state constitutions. But we'll see that in New York. And once that precedent is established, it will become a billy club, I suspect, to be whacking down these crazies who want non-citizens to rule this land. In other words, you imagine, take this scenario, for example. You're Xi Jinping. You're sitting there. You're contemplating how to overwhelm America and turn it into a socialist swamp. And you come up with this grand idea to have 15 million Chinese residents repopulate the state of New York, coming through the southern border. All they need to do is reside in New York for 30 days, and they can vote. They could vote out the existing candidates. They could vote in the farthest left candidate you can think of, AOC blessed candidates. They could turn the city into a formal socialist sister city of Beijing,
Right.
and completely take over all private property and redistribute all wealth.
What happens? Let's say we've only got a couple minutes left. I know I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but let's say it goes to court. Let's say you get a court challenge. The court says, okay, yeah, this is completely invalid. What happens to the elections under which this took place? What happens to the actions of city government by officials that were elected under non-citizen voting? Do you think a court would strike all this down, or do you think a court would just say, all right, just don't do it anymore? And let's get past it.
The past injuries are not redressable by an injunction. So injunctions affect restrictions prospectively. However, if I were a candidate and I lost by a thin margin and the difference would have been provable to be non-citizens, well, then, I think there's a real question there, particularly if the person is still in office who beat you, right? If it's still part of the term that extends from your candidacy, then I think you could challenge the legitimacy of the election and perhaps invalidate the election and become that person. But as you're pointing out, in these cities, Republicans are scarce, and quite frequently when they do run, they get clobbered so badly that probably it wouldn't make up the difference, sadly.
Probably not. Well, Jonathan, we're going to leave it at that, but go over to townhall.com, look up Jonathan Emord's op-ed on this in townhall.com. In the columns there, and that was on December 10th, so you might have to scroll back just a tiny bit, but it's definitely worth it. And once again, just before you leave, Jonathan, we got to take a look at your books one more time just to make sure people know what to look for.
All right, so here's the funny one.
How Biden Stole Christmas, Hanukkah, and Kwanzaa too.
Yeah, and that's a real gem. And then this one, which is really fantastic, but if you don't like it, you can at least do weightlifting with it because it's thick. It's right there. The Authoritarians. Yep. They're horrible. It says the Authoritarians, their assault on individual liberty, the Constitution, and free enterprise from the 19th century to the present.
There you go.
You are.
All right.
All documents.
And Jonathan, where can people go to find you? What's the easiest place for people to go and find you other than townhall.com?
So they can follow me on social media of their choice, or they can, there are a number of places. So you can go to emord.com. Which is my law firm. And you can also go to, actually, there's a store that sells Freedom Wear, which is lovely, that I designed. And it's called, and you can get autographed copies of my books too. But it's called buyfreedomwear.com. That's it, buyfreedomwear.com.
Buyfreedomwear.com and emord.com. Jonathan Emord, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be with you. Take care.